Okay, so for this week, we are looking at um, more specific ways to get the image that you desire. So last week with the scavenger hunt, you guys were shooting on program, which is, or automatic, which is all, the camera decides what the exposure is going to be for you. And if you've never heard that term exposure, it's basically the camera allowing the certain amount of light to hit your sensor. And that's controlled by three things, as you can see in this diagram. It is the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed. Those are the three things that determine what your exposure is going to look like. And so this week we're going to be concentrating on the aperture. Okay, so we're going to talk about the aperture first. The aperture is a mechanism that is inside your camera lens. Usually when you buy your first camera, you buy a kit, and so it comes with the manufacturer's desired lens for that. And you can purchase additional lens that offer you several different kinds of additions. The range of your aperture settings, your f-stops, that's one thing. Also, the amount of wide angle or zoom that you can have. So you can actually end up buying several different lenses depending on what you need them for. What I suggest though, if this is your first photography class, is that you stick with the lens that you have, shoot it this summer, shoot it this semester, and then let's see if you're not getting the look you want, or now you know you want to have XYZ, then you can go and invest in that. Lenses can be very expensive, so it's best if you just kind of play with what you have right now and then purchase later. All right, so the aperture is actually a mechanism that opens and closes, that controls the amount of light that travels through the lens and hits the sensor. This is 1/3 of the equation for what makes a good exposure. Okay, the amount of light that's coming through. Without light, we do not have photography. It's a very, very important part. So the standard full stops that a lens has is sometimes between 4 and 22. Okay, these are the oldest f-stops right here. As the camera has advanced, it has made different f-stops, and sometimes you can go even higher than 32. If you have higher than 32, you have a very expensive lens. So this is kind of like our pupil. It controls the amount of light in the exposure. But the other thing that it does, a very important thing that it does, is it controls our depth of field. Our depth of field is the amount of space in the photograph, in the scene that we're photographing, the amount of that space that's going to be in focus. So, and I'll show you some examples in a few minutes. So let's just say you're up in Boone and Asheville, and you're high up on the hills, and you've got a beautiful overlook, and you want everything to be in focus. You would choose the higher f-stop numbers. Okay, these will allow your photograph to be more in focus, from things that are just maybe 4 feet away from you to infinity, or pretty far out there, several miles. As you as you open up the aperture and allow more light in, the range of your depth of field shortens. Okay, it gets a little bit confusing because it kind of feels like the numbers are wrong, but the numbers have to do with the measurement of the opening. Okay, so as you open the lens up, you're allowing more light in, but you're also lessening the amount of space that will be in focus. Now, just because you don't have as much space in focus doesn't mean that space that's in focus has to be right in front of you. You can actually choose within the scenic look or the scenic view what you want to be in focus. Okay, maybe there's one tree or one mountain that's coming out or whatever. It can be that space. Okay, you will understand what aperture settings, what f-stops that your camera has, it will take you probably a couple weeks of shooting to get this under your belt. It sounds a little overwhelming right now, but believe me, you'll be okay. All right, so going back to our shooting modes, what I would like for you to do for this week is you're going to be shooting on aperture priority. Now that means you change your main dial to A. Okay, that's aperture priority. The other way we use this is in manual. Okay, but this week we're just going to be shooting on A mode. What this means is we're going to select our desired aperture. The camera will figure out the rest of that triangle. It'll figure out the shutter speed and the ISO for us. Okay, and that's okay. We're building our way to using this in full manual mode. So select the A and the A. All right. Now let's look at this on the left-hand side. This, again, like I said, the full stops, the oldest range is kind of in between here, F4 to F16. Okay, these are what are considered whole stops because they've been around for the longest amount of time, and there's a mathematical equation here. So when you go from F4, which is a wide open aperture, if you go to 5.6, you're cutting the light in half. Okay, 5.6 is twice as small as F4. Okay, so depending upon which direction you're moving in the whole stops, you're doubling the light or you're cutting it in half. As cameras have advanced, the manufacturers have gotten that shutter to kind of work more precisely. They have come up with half stops and third stops. Okay, so going from an F2 to an F2.4 to an F2.5, you could see how that's very small, subtle changes, but going from an F2 to an F11, that's a lot of difference in the way your photograph will look. Okay, this information, when you take a picture, it is recorded in what's called your metadata, and it's basic information that's saved on your digital file, and you can program your metadata in a bunch of different ways. In fact, I'll do another video about your metadata, okay? But just trust me, like, this stuff is recorded with each image. So when you're shooting, and this is a Canon camera that we're looking at, and forgive me for my formatting there. So it says AV, that's aperture priority. Again, this is what I want you to, this is what I want you to be shooting on when you're shooting. When you're in manual mode, you have this AV button here that when you press that and then move your main dial, that will change your aperture. Now, for right now, all you have to do is put it on AV or A. Okay, if you have the type of camera that has this dial on the back, because not all Canons do, this can also be your aperture dial when you're in manual mode. Okay, it kind of won't do anything when you're in aperture priority, I don't think. Nikon, here is yours. I don't have that on, but you have a dial on the front and the dial on the back, and so the back is your aperture dial. Okay. All right, so and sometimes on your screen you will actually see the aperture, those kind of blades. That is the universal symbol for a camera or the aperture. Okay, and the apertures are always annotated with an F. That means the f-stop. The f-stop is the measurement to the opening of the aperture. Okay, sometimes people get the f-stop and aperture kind of flip-flopped, and that's kind of normal. Sometimes I'll say, well, what was your aperture setting, or what was your f-stop? Those, I'm asking you the same thing. Okay, so it gets a little confusing, but stick with me. Okay, so all of these images that I'm showing you here are on aperture mode, and you can see that your f-stop is highlighted. It's the one that's visible. So when you're in aperture and then you move your main dial, the f-stop is the number that's going to change. Your ISO may say auto, or it may say the number it's choosing based off of the A setting, so kind of don't worry about that. Your light meter will always be in the middle because the camera is doing the work for you. If the f-stop starts blinking and it starts kind of flashing, it may mean you don't have enough light or you have too much light. But the great thing about digital is that you can see the preview right away. So you can see if you've gone over or under. If your image is white, you have too much light. If your image is black, you don't have enough light. So what you'd have to do, if it's white, you need to close down the aperture. So you need to go to a higher number. If your image is black, you need to open up the aperture, add more light, and so go to a lower number. Okay, after shooting for a couple weeks, you guys will know your f-stops kind of by heart. And I know that sounds very confusing, but if you just trust me and you're paying attention to the f-stop, and this part of your worksheet has everything to do with understanding the f-stop. Okay, so let's keep going here. Let's look at a couple images, and then in another video I'll go over your assignment and your worksheet. Okay, so here's a good example. Just ask yourself, looking at these two photographs of gnomes, they're the exact same photograph. The top one has a shallow depth of field. That means only a small bit of this scene is in focus. You can see the gnome in front of us, and the third gnome in the back is out of focus. Okay, this is a shallow depth of field. This effect is used, I see it a lot in cooking magazines and cookbooks and things like that, in other cases too. And then the bottom one, everything is in focus. So while I don't know their exact settings, I can say to myself, the top one was used with a low number, the aperture's wide open to shallow that space. The bottom one, it's probably, and it's not a huge space, but it's probably like f11 or higher because everything's in focus. Okay, so what will happen is that you will eventually learn what the settings, how they look, how they transform your image. Now, I will tell you right now, if you have like a 70 zoom, 200 zoom, your depth of field will fall off. It'll get out of focus more quickly than a 50 millimeter. Okay, so your size of lens, your amount of zoom will impact how dramatic your depth of field will be. Okay, so the depth of field depends upon your aperture setting, the type of lens that you have, because it determines your range of aperture settings, and then also the focal distance on the lens. Does it have a lot of zoom or not a lot of zoom? Okay. Okay, so here's another one. Now, again, totally depends upon what your camera offers. Like I said earlier, some standard kits only start at 4. So it would be a little more shallow than this photograph. But then as you get up, more and more of those are in focus. Okay, and it's really kind of up to you. This is an image I got offline. I thought the colors were really just kind of beautiful, monochromatic, and then dramatic at the same time. So this, you can see everything's in focus, even the clouds, the trees, as far as the eye can see. So just by looking at a focus, looking at a photograph, we can determine what aperture they use. We may not know exactly, but if we want to try to replicate this look, we can say, okay, we can't go below an f16, okay, because it just has to be f16, f22, f32 if you have it, and any of the half or third stops above f16. Okay, that's what I would say to you if you want to get this look. Now, depending upon the weather and all that kind of stuff, hopefully the lighting will be good for that kind of photograph. But so there are some occasions when we're trying to take a certain looking photograph, but the light of the day is not allowing that. So you have to kind of know what you're going for, but if you can't get it that day, you have to think of, alternative ways of shooting it, or coming back another day, or any other kind of situations. Now, this photograph we can see it's just this leaf, this, you know, these leaves coming in the foreground in the right hand side of the frame. Those are the only thing in focus. And so I can tell automatically looking at this that this is a shallow depth of field image. So I know they're using the lowest numbers on their camera. We're talking below f3.5. Okay, now this also depends upon the zoom. So if you're standing way far away from it and you have a 200 millimeter zoom, you can get this to fall off focus much quicker, maybe at an f4. Okay, so you're going to have to play around a little bit. But so that's depth of field. It is controlled by the aperture. The aperture controls the amount of light that's coming through the sensor. So again, I want you to shoot in AV or A mode. I have a cheat sheet, photographic cheat sheet that I'm going to upload with this assignment, which I do recommend that you print out and put it in your camera bag. It's a wonderful thing to, if you're in the middle of doing something or out there shooting and you have kind of a brain freeze and you're like, oh, what am I supposed to do? You can pull out this piece of sheet that will show you exactly what to do, and it's diagrammed here. Okay, so that is the aperture. It's controlled by, or its measurements are measured in f-stops, controls the amount of light, and the depth of field. In the next video, I will go over the worksheet that you need to do, and then in the final video, what you're shooting this week.